All right. Hello, everybody. So, back again. My name is Damien. I'm a professor at East Stroudsburg University. My students are currently working on a pretty cool group project and at the same time learning some Houdini fundamentals. One of the shots they're working on, they want to explore making some stained glass and lace type effects. So, I wanted to give a little breakdown on some more simple ways of going about this. And hopefully that's beneficial to them and to anyone else watching. So let's go ahead and walk through this scene and see sort of the basics that go into making that effect at the top. We'll be able to make some sort of stained glass windows here and then repurpose this sort of setup to also create some more lace-like objects using similar sort of workflows here. So let's go ahead and start with the basics here with the stained glass. So the way I've constructed this, and really there's always a million ways of making anything. I'm going to go ahead and hide the camera for now. Basically, I'm using fracturing to create everything here. So if that's new to you, essentially what that does is we take some sort of geometry. So in this case, I'm just using a flat plane. We scatter points on it with the scatter node, and we feed that original geometry and those scattered points into a Verneuil fracture, which essentially makes these little cuts around each point, like a little fence. If I show the points, you can see the way this fracturing works is it creates this boundary equidistant between each point, or the average between those points. And so we can scatter less or more points to get more detailed sort of cellular structures or more broad shapes here. That's the backbone of this, Verneuil fracturing. Past that, what we do is isolate the edges so we can have the filling between the stained glass pieces, and we do that using this ends SOP. So this will turn your edges into curves, and all I've done is clicked unroll with new points here under the close U dropdown. And then we can use something like the sweep node to actually make geometry. And in this example, I set it to round tube. You could use a custom geometry. We could use square tube and put a smaller width to get these square filler pieces. And then the other aspect is creating the stained glass in the middle. Theoretically, we could sort of just merge these two together, the border and the Voronoi fracture. But just for kind of options down the road, maybe we want to render the glass without the border or something like that. I have this little setup where we take the Verneuil fracture, and then we just use two poly extrudes. One to inset the points, and so on this extrude I've set the divide into individual elements, and then I'm just adjusting the inset to determine how far to push those points inward. And then I'm using another poly extrude with the transform extruded front checked to determine how thick these pieces will be. So we can use this to determine how thick the shards are. In this case, I did 0.005, which is about 5 millimeters. You could just pick an appropriate thickness for whatever effect you're trying to get here. And I've also made sure to check this output back just so we get some geometry on both sides of the glass. And so that's a window, right? And we could adjust if our inset is too big, we could make our border thicker in this case, or we could make our inset smaller. If I go back to this node and dial this back down, and we got a stained glass. But this pattern isn't really that interesting in terms of stained glass, but it is the kind of basics here. So let's sort of step up here and look at creating a different sort of shape, a more window-like shape. So here what I've done is just taken a circle here. I've made a group and checked enable bounding box to group all the bottom half points. And then I'm using a transform node with that group selected to simply scale those points to 0 on the Y. So if I put it back to 1, you see we get this pill shape. When I do 0, it flattens out those bottom points, and then I can use this translate just to sort of determine the height of that window. Now, instead of just doing kind of random scattering of points, in this example I did some more deliberate things. So if I template this window, I've made a line at the top, and then I've made this sort of branching circular pattern. And then I've used a little noise just to add some variation to those points. This will create a very more geometric fracturing that might be more stained glass like. We could control the amount of points here, and you can see it's making those divisions if I template this based on where those input points are being put. So we can kind of divide that line more, and it adds more cuts at the top. We could adjust how many circle copies and where those are located to get different effects here. We could animate this to get some interesting sort of moving glass shards. The world's really your oyster. So a lot can be done right in this section where we're scattering the points. Then this is the exact same setup with one sort of addition. I put on the Verneuil fracture node, I went ahead and checked this box primitive piece. What that does is assign each of these shards a different value. If we look in our geometry spreadsheet here, we have this piece number, so every piece has its unique number. And then what I can do is make a point VOP, and I'm not going to go really in depth with VOPs in this, just sort of the major theory about how this is being created. Inside this point VOP, I'm using a bind node, which lets you import any sort of attribute, and I'm binding in that piece and making sure to set it to the same type, which is integer. I'm using that to create a random color, and I'm just feeding that into a ramp, so then I can sort of tint this glass however I want. So I could use one of these defaults and get whatever sort of interesting stained glass color variation. All right, so that's another sort of methodology here. I wanted to introduce just another way where we could use the same sort of approach, but use an image to generate how the fracturing occurs. So in this example, I just used the UV texture node to create UVs here. I remesh the shape so we have a lot of triangles, and I create a attribute, in this case density, from this stock mandrel pic. So this is a baboon image. If I go ahead and do UV quick shade, just so we can see this, if I change this to mandrel.pic, this is just a stock Houdini image that I'm using here. And I use this attribute from map to sort of clamp the values down here with this ramp. And then by using this density attribute, I scatter points based on the color values here. So brighter values have more points, darker values have less points. So then when we fracture, we sort of have more shards in those brighter areas. So it's manipulating the shattering based on that image. After that, it's really the same sort of setup here where we're doing the poly extrudes. In this case, I remake the UV texture, and I do the same thing where I assign color values here. But in this case, I'm using it based on that density attribute, which I have copied in from that Verneuil fracture. So a lot of flexibility here with different ways of going about it. If we wanted then to sort of have that baboon, like a hand-painted sort of look on the glass, I could always layer that back in and mix it with the colors underneath once we get into setting up the materials on the stage. But we have these sort of fracturing that are based upon the image now. Okay, so those are some examples of the glass. I'm going to go ahead and step through some of these lace strategies before we get into this final sort of previewed kaleidoscopic effect here. With the lace, you can really do the exact same thing with the Verneuil fracture, but instead of using the geometry, you really just use those curves instead. So this is the very similar setup here where I'm making this initial shape and I'm fracturing it. And in this case, I'm just going to use the end node. I'll use the resample node to get some more point count to this geometry. And then I'll just fuse points that are overlapping and use this polypath node to connect points. That's sort of just some cleanup steps right here with the fuse and the polypath. Then I decided to do something a little interesting where I'm using P-scale here. If I go ahead and press the information button, then preview that. This is just creating some different color values on the geometry. So when I go ahead and use the sweep node, we have some different thicknesses to these threads. And now we sort of have a threading based on that stained glass. The one sort of interesting thing I'm doing here is if we go in close, you can actually see we have multiple strands wrapping around each other here. How I'm doing this is in the sweep node, I'm using this partial twist and actually twisting the geometry. So you can almost make like a braiding effect here. And I'm using a custom profile curve in the second input, which are these three circles. So you can imagine this is sort of the like threading that is getting twisted around the curves. I'm using this match offset to just position a circle above the grid here. And then I'm just copying that 360 degrees. And what I could do is if we zoom in on some of these threadings, I could copy it more times to get sort of a more thread count, like a rope or something like that. And I could go ahead and increase my twist even more to get that twisting. You can see it starts, if we twist too much, it starts to get a little crunchy. We would need to add more samples here in our resample node to get that more smoothed out. But you would want to sort of dictate that by your shot and how close the camera is. You might do interesting things like animate this offset to get sort of a more loose threading that comes together. There's definitely a lot more sophisticated ways about going about this, but if you just need sort of some abstract shapes that sort of appear to be knit, this is a good sort of straightforward way of doing it, where we just take some paths and then we use the sweep node in conjunction with some profile curves to wrap those threadings around the curve. So it does give you an interesting effect there. Some other ways of making lace. So example number 2. This is not necessarily lace, but I just wanted to point out this node as another way to experiment. We could start with an image. So in this case, I just downloaded a random lace image off of a texture website. And if we feed that image into a trace node, what this node does is almost like an Adobe Illustrator where you trace image. It makes curves based on that image. And we can do the exact same thing. We take the ends, so we just get curves. And we could do something like animate a carve node, so we almost have like this growing abstract pattern. Not necessarily exactly like lace, but sort of in that same category or reminiscent, where we can get some interesting sort of visuals, abstract motion graphic like visuals this way. All right, let's do one more example. So if we wanted to be a little more procedural with it, We could start in Houdini and generate that source image in a COP network. So this is a compositing network. If I double click and dive inside, we have this somatic node. So if you've ever seen those videos of like vibrating metal plates and sand or bits of material organizing based on the frequency of this vibration, this is emulating that. So this can create some interesting patterns for us. And what I've done is just hooked up a UV map and UV transform into the position. This allows us just to scale this pattern as much as we want with this UV transform. And then we've hooked up a constant to all of these other channels on this node. Without going too much in depth, this constant will control the sort of frequency of this pattern in X and Y. And then the last two values will give you some interesting sort of distortions. So you can form different patterns here. So there's a lot to experiment with this. So this first constant will help you find a lot of variation. And then on this node itself, this cymatic node, you can adjust things like the anisotropy to get some other sort of variations here. The frequency, similar to the UV transform. And then we can use this pattern to do something like we could feed it into a trace node like the previous example, or we could scatter points based on that color and use something like connect adjacent pieces set to adjacent points. And what this does is literally just draw lines between your points. This is very similar to something like the Plexus add-on in After Effects. So that's not necessarily like knitting, but you could get some sort of thread-like pattern here. We could then use this carve node again, like the last example, to sort of trace on this pattern. But we could also do something like use this pulse animation. I'll link a tutorial that I've done previously for that, to create this sort of pulsing line animation. This to me almost gives it a like hand-drawn sort of graphite feel to it, which is pretty interesting to explore. So this isn't necessarily like a super realistic threading, but more of an abstracted MoGraph approach. And since this is 3D, we can always do things like bend this plane in interesting ways. So we could create sort of interesting camera moves here and animations of this whole shape bending or deforming, or roll it up and have the camera sort of track in with some interesting depth of field on it. A lot of options there. So those are some overall strategies just to get some stylized stained glass and motion. Oh my God. Sorry about that. All right. Sorry about that. Just had a coughing fit out of the blue. But those are some overall ways of achieving some lacy or stained glass looks. Now, let's actually look at what I did for that kaleidoscope rendering. So this gets a little bit more in depth, but not really too much. We have the exact same setup that I showed before with the stained glass, and I went ahead and modified some of the attributes, and I played around with how much fracturing to do on this. But all of this is essentially the same. I'm preparing this for rendering, so I've gone ahead and added a name attribute, which we'll use in Solaris to assign materials. So I've made a name for the border and a name for the glass. And I went ahead and added a UV texture and rest node. The rest node just stores the position of the points, and we can use that for texturing down the line. And past that, I've added this whole kaleidoscope effect. Is that how you spell kaleidoscope? I think I misspelled that. Kaleidoscope. Kaleidoscope. So we have all these nodes, and I'm going to go ahead and add a link in the description to a YouTube video that I largely took this setup from Reese Lundberg. Really great tutorial. But just to give you the TLDR of this effect, if I disable some of these nodes, what's happening here is we are just using the clip node to cut this geometry in whatever way we want. And we're doing that twice, so we get a little slice of it. And you can think of this like how a real kaleidoscope works, where things are just, it's like a tube with mirrors in it, right? So we're just getting a section of the stained glass that we then want to mirror. So these two clip nodes are linked to the controls, and this dictates the amount of sides to the mirror. And there's some math going on these clip nodes. If you remember back to trigonometry, it's using sine and cosine to set the direction of these clips. Reese goes over that in the video, so I'm just gonna kind of skip ahead here. The copy node then just duplicates those sections, and then these are just some cleanup nodes, so we have a consistent face direction to the geometry. And then we get this sort of kaleidoscope effect. So we can use this to control how many sides or how many duplicates of the geometry we're making. And then where it really becomes interesting is if we start transforming or rotating this geometry before any of these mirroring functionalities. So I'm just rotating this whole mirror like so. We get a very interesting kaleidoscoping effect. And the cool thing about this compared to a 2D software package is that we can actually start transforming this in 3 dimensions, and it'll give us some very interesting sort of flowering shapes. Like this could almost be like making a stained glass flower or something like that, depending on how we rotate this and mirror it. So there's a lot of room for experimentation here to make some interesting things. And I might then decrease the border size if we're doing something like this. But you can get some really neat effects with this setup. So I'm just going to undo a few times and get it back to how I had it. And let's talk about then rendering that. So this whole section here, and I'll upload the Houdini file, is that kaleidoscoping effect. Now we'll want to, am I recording? Let me just double check. Yeah, okay, we are recording. So now we might want to bring all of this into Solaris for rendering. So I'm gonna jump over to the stage context here, and I have my viewport set to Solaris. And let's just look at how I set up some of the material attributes for this. So in my last video, I went over how to import geometry and set up the materials and assign them, and how to create some lights. So I'm not going to go in depth for any of these sections. What I really want to show and highlight here is the material setup on this geometry. So if I dive into this material library and select the glass mat, this is what I'm using to create the glass material. Let's kind of break the main sections of this down. So there's a lot of nodes here, but it's not too complicated. Main things to look at are, this is glass. So if you want something to look like glass, and I'm going to go ahead and just do a test render while we're looking at this. If you want something to have glass-like properties, you're going to want it to be transmissive. So that's the first thing to look at on this glass. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect everything. If I make this material transmissive, so by default it's at 0, that means it's an opaque object. If I set this to 1, now it's functioning more like glass. So right now it's sort of like a frosted glass. If I wanted it to be perfectly shiny glass, I could set my roughness down to 0, and now we have some very nice sort of see-through glass. If I hid my backdrop, we might be able to see this more while we're looking through to the background. All right. So now we might want to think about adding some color to the glass. So we can tint the transmission here any color we want to get colored glass. In my case, I want to use the color attribute we created in the network. So what I've done here is I've used the USD Primavera Reader node to bring in the display color. This is one annoying thing about Solaris. In Houdini, this attribute is usually called CD, but when you bring color diffuse or CD into Solaris, it renames it to display color. So we're going to bring in the display color, and I am just using a color correct to adjust some of the values, and I'll just connect this to transmission color to preview how that looks. So we're bringing that in, and we get all those colors that we created. And I can change the gain and exposure to make this lighter or darker or what have you. The other little extra thing I'm doing here is I'm taking some noise. When I look at pictures of stained glass, the color isn't perfect, right? It has some variations from dark to light. So if I preview this noise, I'm going to just disconnect everything and hook up this noise node to the transmission. I have this 3D noise driven by that rest attribute recreated. So rest float 3. This is just adding some subtle sort of noise across the shape. So you can see now parts are more see-through and parts are less see-through. So we have this sort of additional detail here to the glass. And I'm using that and multiplying it against my base color just to get some variation to my transmission. So I'm going to undo this just to get all my hookups back to normal here. Undo, 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 undo. So that's what's happening here. I'm using this noise just to add some more detail to both the amount of transmission and the color of the transmission. So some parts are more see-through, some parts are less see-through, some parts are lighter and darker. I'm also hooking up that color just to base color to tint the base color when parts are less transmissive. The other thing that I think is adding a lot to this is I'm using some noise to add some bumpiness to the normals. And I might have gone a little extreme here, where if I get real close, we can see there's this sort of bumpiness I've added to the glass. So this is sort of a good angle for us to see it. I'm doing that just with noise driven by my UV coordinates. So I'm using a 2D noise here. Both of these are just driven by the coordinate system. That's just the texture coordinate node to bring in the UVs. And then I'm using a transform 2D node to scale those UVs in different ways. So if I disconnect one noise, I have this sort of more broad noise adding almost this sort of rippling to the glass. So you can see how these refractions are getting bent a bit. That is where this noise is coming in. And I'm using this UV node, transform node. If I want it to be stretched more, I could scale it to get more stretched out ripples. If I wanted less ripples, I could reduce the frequency on this. And then I'm using another noise, in this case set to Worley, and I'm using a very, very high frequency noise to get this tiny little bumpiness. Maybe this is too much. I could go into the post process and just make this a very, very subtle noise that I'm adding onto this first unified noise. If I wanted this effect to be very realistic, I would take some time and research different glass processes and sort of nail down how these bubbling effects form. But for this, we're using sort of a more stylized approach, and I'm not too concerned with it. I just wanted to get some breakup to how these refractions are forming. All right. All of those noises are added together, and here in the material, in order to convert a black and white noise to a normal map, we use a height to normal, and I'm using a very, very small scale here, and we then pump that into a normal map node and hook that to the normal slot. So I'm not actually displacing geometry, I'm just faking these refractions. And you can see here, if I disconnect this normal node and let that render a little bit, you'll see that the refractions are very smooth. We don't really get any bending of the background through the glass. All right. So I'll hook that back up. You can see, especially up here, the differences with that bending. And then the one last thing I'm doing is I'm bringing in that piece attribute that was formed with the Verneuil fracture. And I'm using that to just create a random value to drive my roughness. So this just makes some of the glass pieces more frosty and others less frosty. So if I wanted them to be quite frosty in places, I could set the maximum value to 1. Then we have almost like a very sort of opaque frosted glass. If I just wanted it to be very subtle in places, I could set this to a very low value, just to get some more variation to it. And that is the basis of the material setup. So I encourage you to sort of break this down, break this Houdini file down, rewire things, play with the attributes to get whatever look you desire. It could be interesting to shine light through this and get some sort of caustic light being cast on the background. I just noticed I'm actually shoving this through the backdrop. In this case, I put a light behind the glass just to give it like a little glow coming through. And if we scrub the timeline, this is all sort of procedurally updating. And you could make a really interesting visual with this. There's lots of room to play here. So yeah, I think that'll do it with this little walkthrough. This is not sort of a step-by-step tutorial, but hopefully an sort of auxiliary video that you can use while developing your own projects. And I will link the Houdini file for anyone to kind of rip apart and see how everything is formed. So thank you so much for watching this video, and hopefully it is helpful for our project as well as anyone else's project. See you all later.